Hi, I'm Adam and welcome once again to South Wales Ghost Watch. And once again we've got Martin on the show.
Hi.
And today we're going to be talking about synchronicity, coincidence and causality. Now you're probably aware from looking at that through your cameras that the show's in black and white for the first time. I hope you guys are okay with that at home. Now, Martin, the first question I'd like to ask you is causality. How would you define causality?
We are used to thinking that every event that happens is caused by another event. So there's a whole series of cause and effect. I go out and drink a couple of bottles of red wine, and what causes me then to feel rather ill is the red wine. The next day I go and do therapy and I don't feel like listening to people because I'm hungover. Because I'm hungover, I don't give my best. So there's a whole series of cause and effect all the way through. What we try to do as human beings is to continually look for the cause of any particular event. There are problems because we are looking back after the event has occurred and looking at the causes. So a historian might want to say, why did the Roman Empire fall? There's a whole series of causes looking back into history that we can interpret. But each cause we identify is influenced by the way we look at the world. And so if the cause is influenced by that interpretation, so is the effect. We might suggest that people get themselves into horrendous messes because that is something they have done, but there may be an accidental event. The major problem with cause and effect is if everything that occurs has a cause and a consequence effect, then if you go back, you should be able to go back and 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 back till you find an uncaused cause.
Okay.
That's what causality is about. But remember, as I said, causality is our interpretation after the event. So sometimes we always have to be aware of our interpretation to understand.
Okay. So can you give me an example of causality?
Yeah, certainly. There might be a situation where somebody doesn't put enough petrol in their car and their car runs out of petrol and breaks down. Very simple cause and effect.
Yeah.
You might have a situation where somebody, as I said, drinks too much and feels lousy the next day. Somebody causes themselves to become ill by not looking after themselves properly. But what is the cause? That's the problem. We're continually looking for it. At the moment, people are looking at a link between heart disease and gum health. But you see, if you look firmly enough for any cause, you can find what you want. I was arguing with somebody the other day who said that the present debate over gay marriage was wrong. And I said, well, I don't think that we should let people be as they want. And they said, oh, well, every society that has ever allowed gay marriage has always collapsed. And they quoted the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire just ran out of people because they had a plague. It was nothing to do with what their sexuality was like.
Yeah, yeah.
So cause and effect is always going to be influenced by your prejudices and your opinions. So in a psychic investigation, you can always find what you want if you're not careful. That's why every event in a paranormal sense that happens, you have to look for normal, rational explanation. And when you can't find any more explanation, that's when you know you've got an abnormality. And as a result, cause and effect is the way that proper scientific investigation goes on. If a group of people are there together and they believe in a common view of the world, then what happens is going to be interpreted by that common view of the world. So if you look at other alternatives, other explanations, you're really working in a proper way.
Okay. Coincidences. Why do so many coincidences occur in modern life, do you think?
Well, let's think of it like this. A coincidence is something that you are constructing after the event has occurred. Some years ago, I was doing therapy with a client who was telling me about a horrible boyfriend. I had to take my tax form in and I walked down to the tax office. On the way down, this rather large guy virtually ran past me, nearly knocking me over, and apologised. And he was chatting, he said, "I'm sorry, my girlfriend and I have just been rowing." And I had this strange sort of, I said, "Oh, yeah," he said, "she's been to see some therapist bloke." I thought, "Oh, where was this? Walters Road." Who was the name? Therapist? Martin Shrewsbury. It was the bloke. That was a coincidence. A coincidence might also occur when you're thinking of somebody and you suddenly bump into them. A coincidence is something that has meaning for yourself, that you can clearly see. It's something that is constructed after the event, but is influenced by what you're thinking about before. There was a coincidence a few weeks ago where I was waiting at Neath station to catch a train. It was announced the train had failed and I caught the next train. On the train was one of my clients who was running late. I would have, if I'd have actually caught that earlier train, I would have been there ages before. That's a sort of example, coincidence. Yeah. They're not caught, there's no cause and effect there, there's just a significance that is useful and helps you make the best of things. If you think about it, it's like making the best of a situation, of what is happening. And by looking at that event, you work the best possible solutions out.
Okay. Should we be surprised then by a coincidence?
I think if we're open and we're looking and we're psychologically prepared for change, then we'll notice more coincidences. Let's introduce the concept of a black swan. No, a black swan is not a black swan that swims on the water. It's an event that cannot be predicted. I'll give you an example. In the Middle Ages, people said all swans were white. Then they discovered Australia and they found it was full of black swans. So the phrase black swan means an event that cannot be predicted. It's an event that changes what you thought reality was. But once it's happened, once it's happened, you can then reinterpret you can interpret back into the past. So when a historical event occurs, people say, "Oh yeah, this happens because of this and this and this and this." Most of the things that are black swans, we could not have predicted. So most of the jobs we get, we couldn't have predicted. Most of the people we meet in relationships, we couldn't have predicted. So when we are surprised, it's because we can't predict things. If I think of the film Blade Runner, which I saw many years ago, by now we should be in flying cars. Nothing that's ever been predicted seems to have come true. Economic theory is a theory that explains how things might be in the future, but it's something that that we haven't got right. So you could make an argument that nothing worthwhile has ever been predicted. So when we notice coincidence, it may indicate that we're looking around more clearly. If you said to somebody, if on 9/11 they had made doors on planes of reinforced steel, then nobody would have been able to get through to the pilots. But nobody knew that was going to happen. Yeah. 10 years ago, when Saddam Hussein was removed by the Americans as the dictator of Iraq, looking to where we are now, we now see that the Shiite majority in Iraq are now free to be able to cause havoc elsewhere. What Saddam Hussein was doing was keeping a buffer between Iraq and Iran. We couldn't have predicted a historical fact about what would happen. If Harold, who lost the Battle of Hastings to William the Conqueror, if Harold had won the battle, we would all be Anglo-Saxons now. Wales would still be independent, and Scotland would be as well. And if he hadn't gone to the north to defeat the Norwegians, his army wouldn't have been exhausted, and he would have probably beaten William the Conqueror. And we'd have been in a very different historical pattern. If you think about the development of penicillin, it was purely coincidental. Madame Curie was discovering that the penicillin grew in a bowl that she'd left on the windowsill. Viagra was invented by accident. It was initially a drug to deal with arthritis and Parkinson's, and they suddenly noticed it had other effects. So every invention seems to be a coincidental. There isn't such a thing as I am going to build this and I'm going to build this and I'm going to build this. There are coincidental side effects that we look at and then interpret after the event.
So really we can learn from them then, can't we?
You can learn from them.
Yeah.
So coincidence is something when you are at your best and you see the possibilities. Yeah. Hydroponics, let's talk about hydroponics being invented by that. Do you know how hydroponics was invented? There's a small island called Wake Island that the Americans had, and they used to land planes there. But they were planes for the very wealthy, and they had to grow salad. Wake Island is made virtually entirely of very poor quality earth. So they developed hydroponics and grew salad from there. And hydroponics today are used in all sorts of other ways.
Yeah.
The theory of hydroponics was always there, but it wasn't used. So scientific knowledge, scientific breakthroughs, any understanding often works by accident.
Okay. So do you think it's relevant or an act of God when a person's life is affected by a series of bad coincidences?
There was a very interesting piece of research done recently about lucky and unlucky people. Richard Wiseman, who is a complete skeptic of any psychic phenomena, did some research on noticing how lucky and unlucky people behaved. What they did was they asked people to classify themselves as lucky and unlucky, and then they left £20 notes around. What they found was that people who considered themselves lucky spotted the £20 notes, whereas people who considered themselves to be unlucky did not. So that if you give yourself negative suggestions and consider that nothing is ever going to work out, then yes, you don't spot the potential. Now the whole issue of whether it's caused by a god or whatever is a vast area. If we have free will to choose to do what we want to do, then that would be the situation in which we would find the most possible ways of discovering new things, of looking at talents. If everything is inevitable, then we don't need that. That's not necessary, and we become very cut off from the possibilities we have. So, is it an act of God? Is it coincidence? Is it an accident? As humans, we're always trying to make sense of what goes on. We try to make sense of an event after it's happened. We try to think about what may happen. We have a rough guide to how the week's going to be. We know how we're going to behave in certain situations. But there's always something that can come along and surprise it. And it may simply be that out of the unexpected comes more possibilities. If you think about it, it's like a series of roads. I can tell you exactly how I got here today, the roads I walked down. But when I leave here, I have ultimate choice on which other roads I go, whether I go left or right. where I end up on the left or right will give me another series of choices. So it may simply be that the future is a series of, if you like, of decisions. There may well be points where we can decide which way we go or which way we don't go. Forrest Gump was a film on Saturday night, and Mr. Gump commented, perhaps there is a destiny, perhaps everything is just random, perhaps it's a bit of both. I've rather liked that idea. It suggests that there are areas of least pressure that we can go down, and also we are maximally free at certain others.
Okay. Synchronicity. When two events, causally unrelated, which are unlikely to occur together in a meaningful manner.
Yes.
Can you give me an example of synchronicity?
Yeah, very simply. About 30 years ago, I lent a book out to somebody which I never got back. One of the big things about me is my ultimate sense of trust in anybody is if I lend them a book. So I obviously screwed that up that time. But I thought about, it irritated me, and some 30 years later I was down at the Gower Heritage Centre, and there was a series of second-hand books there, and I looked across, and there was an exact copy of the book. I thought, that's interesting. I looked in the book and it was my copy, my name was in the front of it. That's an example of synchronicity. There was a case where Carl Jung was doing psychotherapy with a young woman and he just couldn't break through, couldn't get through. And she was telling him of a dream of a scarab beetle. Just at that point he looked on the windowsill and there was a beetle, just like that. And she noticed it as well. So there are a series of events that occur where you make sense of them, but they're not connected, but they make sense to the person who is undergoing that process. One of my own views on synchronicity is that it occurs when we are most about to make change in ourselves. It's an indication of psychological change. We both notice situations that we can, that makes sense to me. Sometimes you're looking for a book and you have a sixth sense to go somewhere, or you have a sixth sense that something is going to happen. You're not sure how, and you know it's going to happen, but you're not sure it's going to happen. And another event causes that to happen. And as a result, they aren't connected. There is no causality between them. There is no cause and effect. Yet somehow they are linked. Carl Jung tells a story when he was writing his book on synchronicity that he was sitting on the beach writing about synchronicity. And he just remembered that he had had a dream the night before about fish. He thought, that's interesting. He connected that with lots of other symbols and he began to write. And he just looked over, and there, lying on the beach, was a dead fish that he hadn't noticed before. So there's an event there that is connected.
Right.
Yeah?
Yeah.
It's like sometimes you're trying to avoid somebody, and you know you should actually own up to it and confront them and talk to them about it, and you do your best to avoid them. And who is the first person you actually meet when you go around the corner? There they are. Something that your inner self needs to happen, part of you is denying it, but you set up a situation by which it happens.
Okay, right.
That's a prime example of synchronicity.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
So, I mean, can we learn from remarkable coincidences? You said earlier that you mentioned bad coincidences.
Yes.
And that is something that we can learn from, isn't that?
Oh, most definitely.
Yeah.
It's about learning to maximise our opportunities and not to believe that things are going to go wrong. Let's think of a situation. So as I'm walking along the road one day and I see you coming along the other side and I'm smoking my pipe and thinking deeply about one particular client and I don't notice you, and you walk past me and you just think, has Martin angry with me? The point is I'm very short-sighted, and secondly I'm thinking about other things. And then you think, what could I have done? So you go through in your mind a whole series of events, what you might have done or what you feel guilty about, or whatever, that you might think of might have really irritated me, and then you start getting a bit really distressed about it.
Yeah.
And then you begin to avoid me. And it goes on like that, yeah?
Right, yeah.
But all that comes down to is an interpretation of a particular event at a particular time because of your mood, you know? That's essentially, so we have to think positively to get the most out of situations. What is possible? What can we do with this information, and how can we connect it?
Okay.
That's really what we're looking for.
I see. So what's your theory on supernatural or psychic forces playing a role in events that coincide?
Well, there are two levels here. There are two levels to look at this. On a scientific level, we can look at quantum theory. We know from quantum theory that every electron in the universe knows where every other electron is. We are quantum beings. We are quantum beings who are experiencing that. And so every event that occurs will influence every other event. Notice I say influence. Notice I don't say cause.
Cause, yeah.
Now, psychic phenomena. If this is a limited world and we don't see it all, then we don't have enough information so that the other side will be able to sense what is going on, will be able to help at certain times, and will be able to help push us in certain directions. Certain hauntings like poltergeist phenomena are caused by energy. Certain hauntings are copies of great emotional turmoil that happened at a particular time. So if a haunting is on another level an echo of what has been, or that there are beings out there that influence us, then it's a whole new range of communicating and influencing and pushing us down certain ways. So a very negative area would be making us see the least possible good news out of it. If you think of the Harry Potter books, J.K. Rowling is a recovered depressive, where she would dream or she would sense that everything bad was going to happen. J.K. Rowling produced an idea of a creature called the Dementor. And the Dementor sucked out of you every good and positive thought. It's a perfect representation of depression on a scientific level, but on a psychological or a parapsychological level, it's an explanation of why things are like that. So that if people believed in guardian angels and things were going to help them in particular things, or they had a lucky pen that would help them during exams, or a St. Christopher that kept them safe during journeys, they are least likely to worry. They are more likely to see the best of situations and think positively about the events. So that's really how it's tied in.
I see, okay, right, yeah. If higher forces are influencing events, do you think that fatalism is possible and that most future events are inevitable? You mentioned free will earlier.
I mentioned free will earlier.
Yeah.
Right, okay. This is a standard debate about whether everything is predetermined, whether it is meant to happen, will happen. There are two positions here. If everything is meant to happen for a purpose, and everything is meant to happen in that way, then logically we would learn nothing from it, because it's already been determined to action. We're essentially robots. We're essentially bots who are told how to behave. So we have to have choice. We have to have, or the illusion of choice, yeah? Or the appearance of choice to be able to cope with living. I suppose if you look at it clearly enough, we all operate on the belief that we are free, that bad things won't necessarily happen, that if we think positively, good things will, then we're already beginning to break out of that free will. For religious people who believe that everything is predetermined, what would be the point of creating robots?
But sometimes if we sense something is going to happen and that thing actually happens, is that kind of like an...
But sometimes we have a sixth sense not to go, and we are okay. A friend of mine was due to give a seminar in the Twin Towers on 9/11. When he had this terrible sense that he should not go. He didn't, and he's still with us. We know that on planes that crash and trains that crash, there are usually significantly less people than there are when trains run normally and don't crash. There is clearly some sort of indication or some awareness that something negative could happen, and consequently we can avoid it.
Okay.
What I think really happens is that there are significant numbers of people that you meet at times who best help you to achieve your ends. But you have choice at that moment whether you go for the positive or the negative, or whether you learn from it and thereby move on to another cycle of change. It might be that there are small moments when coincidences occur. And as a result of that, we move forward and we learn. If we're stuck, if we don't see the maximum possibilities, if everything is predetermined, then we can't learn, because we only learn by making mistakes and doing the wrong thing.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so do you think that some coincidences stem from the unconscious mind? An example would be in Psychology of the Psychic by David Marks, where he states that a person dreaming of a plane crash, which in this case would be event A, will be matched by seeing that the plane would crash the next morning, event B.
Yeah, it's possible that people may have that sixth sense. An awful lot of people said to me that they dreamt of Princess Diana dying that night she died, in the Paris crash. You probably dream a lot about public figures, something happening to them, what you actually are doing is sensing what might happen. If you're in a car that's not maintained properly, that you don't service regularly, then you're more likely to have an accident. But if we are able to maximise the best and think positively, then we avoid those negative things.
Okay.
I always had a sort of I remember just before my finals having a dream that I went to the notice board and I saw that I got a first class degree and I'd also failed. I was there twice. That was an anxiety dream.
Yeah.
Sometimes that will stop us seeing what's going to happen. And sometimes we can be so negative we fear the very worst is going to happen. But sometimes we can be so positive and we're not prepared, we're stunned when something negative happens. It's a question of being open. And sensing what's going to be.
Okay. American physician Deepak Chopra believes that all coincidences have meaning, and that everybody who experiences these coincidences should take note so we're able to understand the world and the universe. What do you think about that?
I think that's a very interesting idea. In the Eastern mind has this idea that we have karma, and that by being good or bad, we influence how our future lives are going to be. If we are, I suppose, continually ripping people off, continually seeing how we can get to the main charms for ourselves, we don't learn about friendship, we don't talk about emotions, we don't learn to develop trust. We get stuck in negative ways. So what Deepak Chopra is actually saying is, by learning about every event that happens, we learn how to change ourselves, and we learn to make the best of it and to see the possibilities of every cloud having a silver lining, every situation happening. As I said earlier, most scientific discoveries happen by accident. My good friend Lee, who has been on this show several times, I always sensed that he had an interest in the paranormal, and I couldn't quite work out why I never talked to him about it. And the reason we never talked about it was that we were both fairly politically active and we didn't like to go there. We thought people would laugh at us, but when we stopped being politically active, we discovered there was so much in common, that you are naturally drawn to people who you feel comfortable with. There, if you did a psychological experiment where you put a group of 20 people in a room and asked people to go and stand next to the person they feel most comfortable with, without talking to them, you would find the people you stand next to would share a lot of common experiences, without even any communication occurring. So if we learn about the world, if we learn about spotting events that happen, if we understand what a symbol means to us, that might give us a hint.
Okay.
Yeah?
Yeah. What's the connection between synchronicity, causality and Carl Jung?
Mr. Jung.
Carl Jung.
Carl Jung was a very eminent psychologist. His father was a Lutheran minister in Switzerland. His mother was a spiritualist. Carl Jung was never like Freud. He never accepted a purely scientific view of the world. He said, let's make sense of it. Let's actually observe. And Jung began to look at how events happened. He looked at how one event one event could be made sense of. Jung was very interested in Eastern ideas, and he thought that the world was continually adapting and giving us messages. He believed that we all share something called the collective unconscious, which is like a reservoir of legends, stories, myths, beliefs that we share. He said that if you actually speak to the mad, you'll find that a lot of the illusions they have come out of mythological stories. And he believed that there was a connection in the collective unconscious which we all shared. Not the individual unconscious we have, but something that all of us have. And that when an event occurs in the world, we sense something is about to happen. A lot of the children in Aberfan talked about having dreams the night before the slag tip at Krishna school. One little girl said that she dreamt she went to school and it was covered in something. Is an event like that affected us via the collective unconscious? You know?
Yeah.
My friend who avoided the Twin Towers on 9/11, was that something there like that? Jung was interested in how that happened, and so he tried to make sense of it and analyse it scientifically. Yeah? Why should a murder 30 years ago still influence a particular place? Why should a particular event make sense to somebody and not to the other? We know that people who analyse and observe, if part of their brain, I think it's called the thalamus, is slightly irregular on one side, then you're more likely to spot things than people who don't believe. Yet if you give unbelievers a shot of dopamine, they begin to see things as well.
Okay, yeah.
So if we are tuning ourselves in constantly to what is going on, then we are learning to spot that. And Jung was fascinated in how that happened. And he said there is something else going on psychologically that we cannot predict by observing people. There is something in themselves that makes sense of it to the experience that goes on.
Okay. So Carl Jung wrote a book, The Interpretation of Nature and the Psyche.
Yes.
What's that about?
That's about how an event might... you can look at it as basically as not walking under cracks on a paving stone, not walking under a ladder. If you see a blackbird, it means something's going to happen. Yeah? He's looking at how we make sense of the world and how synchronicities can occur by our interpretation to give us a warning, a sign of opportunity, or a chance to make a psychological connection. There are various key events where, given a slight difference, that we would all be in a very different situation. Let's look at the miracle that each and one of us are. we are the product, essentially, of a particular sperm reaching an ovum. We are unique. We've already been through that millions of choices, yeah, and one made it, yeah.
Yeah.
Why is it that particular people have particular talents? Yeah. Why can they make certain sorts of interpretations or understandings or be so creative? Why was it that Carl Jung was able to put these things together? Because he was looking at, in a non-causal way, what other explanations are there for this event happening?
Okay. How did Carl Jung's theory of synchronicity get him involved in the paranormal?
Well, Carl Jung was very influenced, I think, by his mother. His PhD thesis was based on studying a medium's seance, and he always had that fascination with folklore, myth and the paranormal. Jung himself had this gift, we think, from his mother, and right through his life he was always looking for ways to explain that and to make sense of it. When he died, he had a near-death experience in 1944 and had a very close, he slipped on the ice as an elderly man and nearly died. He hung above the earth, he saw the earth exactly as it was, and the explanations and the description of what he saw could only be confirmed in the 60s and 70s, once we'd had the rockets up there to see what it would look like from that point. So he would have said that his belief in the paranormal, his belief in analysing what went on, and his own interpretations, his own experiences, came together to make sense of how we fit in to the world and how we understand that world. So that's really the connection.
And our talents can be shared with others.
Can be shared with others,
okay,
yes.
Fair enough. Okay, so how did Carl Jung influence your interest in the paranormal?
I'm a weird person. I've never really,
I've never said that.
I'm not. I've never really been interested in, if you like, the idea that all we're here for is just a material being. You know, that there always has to be deeper explanations. I remember horrifying the vicar when my grandmother, when I was 8, I just read Eric von Däniken's Chariots of the Gods, and I told the vicar that Jesus was a spaceman. I think I probably offended him immensely. I'm still doing that to people all the time now. So I was always looking for the bits they told you shouldn't look at, the bits that they said couldn't possibly happen, and I used to ask why? I wanted to know. I think now that there is no such thing as absolute truth, that we are continually searching for meanings that make sense to the world. Carl Jung makes perfect sense to me in the way that he said, let's look and see what happens, and let's ask the questions that we don't know the answer to. So Jung's idea was to combine psychology, spirituality and the scientific outlook. I was fascinated by horoscopes. Jung looked at horoscopes. Jung looked at why things happen. So my fascination comes from the fact that Jung was looking at things that people didn't normally look at. I read his book, Memories, Dreams and Reflections, a good 30, 35 years ago, and it just made sense to me. So this idea of why things happen have always been there. Jung explains the idea that this world seems random at times, and yet there seems to be something going on that's just beyond the surface of our analysis. So we continually look there, and we know that the most imaginative people, those people who dream, those people who are creative, usually make the most breakthroughs. What it is that makes us like that is the great mystery, and that's why Carl Jung is so significant.
And of course you mentioned the Black Swan as well earlier.
And the Black Swan, yes.
About events that cannot be explained.
About events that cannot be explained, precisely.
Okay.
That's what it's, so, you know, Jung and Freud battled it out.
but he had that challenge of seeing all these events and trying to learn
Yes.
and explain them.
Yes.
Yeah.
Carl
So-
Jung wrote about flying saucers. In the first book series on flying saucers, he looked at what they were about. Were they visionary rumours, he called about. He wrote about most of the things that Freud would never look at. Freud was as insistent as religious fundamentalists that his views were right, you know, and he constructed certainty. Jung said, there is no certainty, but keep inquiring and look at possibilities. So that's where synchronicity came from, that's where all these things happened.
Okay, so do you believe that life is more of a challenge for us all than a gift then, in that case? If you
Challenge and a gift. Life is about exploration, and life is about, I think, being truly yourself.
Yeah.
And the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche said, imagine that you were forced for eternity to go through every event, every sorrow, every joy, every disaster, over and over and over again, forever, and you knew it would happen. What would that do? He said it would cause you to live in the now and to see what's really going on. And I think Jung would have agreed with that. To live in the now and observe as much as you can and get the maximum out of existence. There's a very famous story about how smoking can save your life. J.B. Priestley, the great writer, was about to fly across the North Sea, and he was a pipe smoker like me, and he was told he couldn't come on the plane because he was smoking his pipe. And he said, if I do not smoke my pipe, I will die. So he said, I'm sorry, Mr. Priestley, you can't come on. So they kept him off. The plane took off, crashed into the North Sea, and everybody was lost. J.B. Priestley commented that was how smoking saved your life.
That's very interesting, isn't it? That's
I'm not using
fascinating.
that as an endorsement of smoking.
No,
I'm
of
saying
course
that
not. No.
As a means of looking at possibilities.
Lovely. Well, thanks very much for coming on the
Thank
show
you.
again, Martin. It's been a pleasure talking to you as always.
Thank you.
And that's all we've got time for tonight, guys. But thanks for tuning in.
And lots of synchronicities could happen to
Yes.
you, so send them in to Ian.
And I hope you've enjoyed our show. And as always, we'll be back with you. Not next week, the following week, the week after. And there we are, guys. Take care. Have a good evening. Ta-ra for now.
Bye.